Montana Territory, January 78. Harlan Boone, a crazy mountains lion rider, hears 3 newborn cries braided into the wind and stakes his life on them. Storm, wire, law, and a split cottonwood nameboard, a pine spoon, a Navajo red shawl. Saddle up, ride it clean to the last bell. Gray came first, not dawn, not day, just that lean color that slides in over snow and sets a man to checking the shape of things, a fence line he knew by hand more than I, the pitch of the ridge, the way the wind ran the tops of the lodge poles like a palm through horsehair. Harlan Boone took it in without hurry. Cold has a way of making talk foolish. He set a knee to the saddle skirt, snugged the latigo one more hole, and stood a minute listening to the wire sing under the gust. He was a line rider for the cattle outfit down in the flats. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Not much to the job, but distance and weather and keeping the fence right side up when both tried to lay it down. The crazy mountains shouldered the north. Like a wall God had meant to be closer and never quite finished. Late January put a white cap on the whole stretch. Drifts rounded out the fences till they looked like the ribs of a big buried animal. The dun gelding shifted, blew steam. Boone rubbed a cracked knuckle along the saddle horn till the sting settled, then swung up and moved out along the wire. Hoofbeats came dull off the crust, then broke through to the powder with a sound like a man tearing old cotton. Every 100 yards or so he'd neck-rein the horse into the wind and lean from the saddle to rap a post with the back of his glove. Sound told him what sight would not. Solid where the note came back sharp, rut where it thudded low. He carried kinking pliers in the saddle scabbard and a handful of staples in the pocket of his coat. Where the barbs had gone slack, he'd take a bite of wire, twist, count the turns in his head, 3, 4, 5, and listen for the pitch to come up just shy of song. He could tell by feel when it would hold through a blow and when it would lay down at the first hard shouldering from a steer with ideas. Coffee sat in a tin cup on the near snowbank, dark as creek water under ice. He'd poured it off a small fire at first light, sticks no bigger than his thumb. Flame kept mean on purpose so the smoke wouldn't give him away to eyes that had no business out here this early. He set a pinewood spoon across the rim to keep the scorch off the tongue. Steam went up and blew sideways, then away. He wanted little from the world. A lit porch, if a man could have such a thing without folks asking who for. An unlocked door, because he'd found that bolts grew like habits, and both had a way of turning mean on a man if he let them. A place where a body could hear wind and not mistake it for company. The gray lifted by inches. A crow split the air once and crossed the fence like it was drawn there for him alone. Boone propped a leaning post with a cross stay he'd cut from a deadfall up the slope. He set it with his boot heel, drove 2 staples close, and leaned back till the wire bit the leather of his glove. Good. He spat once and it froze before it hit the ground. Down slope the flats lay under a lid of fog that would burn by noon if the sun found a way through. He had no plans for the noon. Plans are what winter likes to change. He'd ride the run to the far corner where the line turned to meet the switchback trail, then circle the seam where the fence dog-legged around an old cottonwood stump he didn't trust. He carried a short-handled post maul behind his leg, tied off to the stirrup fender, and it thumped his boot with a metronome steadier than any preacher's voice. When he came to a low spot where snow packed deep and the wire went under, he swung off and broke the drift with his forearm. The dun stood with his head down like a churchman. Boone reached to the front hoof, picked it up, and thumbed ice out of the frog, then did the same for the off fore. He slapped a bit of crust from the fetlocks and cinched the blanket tighter over the horse's loins. He did not talk to him. The animal knew what the hands meant, and a mouthful of words wouldn't make the work warmer. He rode on. A coyote crossed the cut at a trot, light as a shadow. Boone watched him take the wind and quarter off into the dog-hair pines where the snow lay less honest and the ground kept its secrets better. He came to a gap where the wire had broken. The land told him how. Nothing to do with deer or bull. The cut was low, close, clean, steel on steel. He knelt and put his glove to the broken end. Fresh rust, some boy with more time than sense, or a man looking for a shortcut, or the wind working on what a poor staple job years back had begun. He measured the distance in his head, pulled a coil of wire from the saddle, and bridged it with a spliced twist that would make a north wind think twice. He tamped a foot of snow back against the bottom strand so calves wouldn't nose under come thaw. Light leaned up over the ridgeline slow as a cow getting to her feet. The lodgepoles quit their shiver and went to a steady bow. The fence came right for a while. Boone let the dun pick his own track along the lee of a snow hump and took the cup from the bank. He held it in both hands till the heat bit his palms, then blew and sipped. Smoke had gotten into it. He didn't mind. Coffee's hot, words ain't. The sound of it surprised him a little. He hadn't heard his own voice since yesterday when he'd told the gelding to quit chewing the latigo. The words fell into the snow and lay there. No echo, no answer. He tipped the last swallow into his mouth and set the cup down on a flat of snow where the sun might find it later and bake some of the taste back out. He laid the spoon over it again, a small bridge between hunger and sense. He drew his glove tight, tugged the ear of his hat lower against the wind, and went back to where the fence turned the corner of the world he was paid to mine. There was a section where the posts had gone short in their holes, frost heave and rot chewing from both ends. He walked there, leading the dun, feet sinking to the ankle, mind empty the way some folks pray. He counted with the sway of the horse's head, post, post, gap, rock, post. He slipped a length of cedar stay under a low strand and raised it to keep a steer from learning a habit. He was careful not to leave glove warmth on the wrong steel. Frost takes its due quick and clean. A hawk watched him from the blue ice sky and drew a single circle, then slid downwind and was gone. He felt something like a second pair of eyes for a beat and then nothing. The ridge had a way of putting a man back to the measure he'd come with. He stopped after a long pull where the line laid up against a blown-down pine. The tree had fallen weeks ago in some other storm, peeled white under bark where the rub had scoured it. He could smell sap even in the cold. He shouldered the wire up over the deadfall, tacked it to a sound limb, and felt the whole fence take a breath it hadn't known it was holding. He leaned there against the trunk, one palm flat, and let his fingers thaw just enough to burn. Far off down the draw, a sound like loose tin fussing in a wind made him turn his head. It was only ice moving in the creek, catching and letting go around a rock. He listened to it a while and thought of nothing. That was his best talent. Men with a mind full of themselves got lost quicker than calves in a spring flood. He worked the spur-of-the-moment repairs till the shadows changed sides, and the sky came on toward that pallid blue that means a day will stay cold no matter how it tries to shine. He thought of the cabin and of the stove iron going from dumb to talk if he set the right kindling under it. He thought of the door with no key, because a key is a promise to be somewhere, and he was not the sort to promise. He thought of a porch light not for welcome but to teach the dark which side of the boards it belonged on. He reined up where the fence swung wide around a stump big as a man's chest, cottonwood, old, rotted to lace inside, still standing out of meanness. He set his glove to it and pushed. The trunk held because some things just do. He cut a cross stay and wedged it between stump and next post, and listened to the voice of the wire when he pulled it tight. Better. The dun stamped. Not bad temper. Cold foot. Boone stepped down and picked the near hind, worked the packed snow from the cleft, and patted the gaskin with a flat hand. The horse's hide twitched under the glove. Boone slung his leg back over the saddle and sat quiet a while with his hands on the horn, feeling the leather warm his palm where the cold had made a stranger of it. Wind came down slope with a new tone. He knew the ridge's music. This was the song it sang when Weather thought about turning, then decided there was more work to do on the business at. In hand. He looked toward the switchback trail, one line of dark carved through pale, running for timber. If anyone came up it today, they'd be the sort of person a man did not meet by chance. But the trail was empty, and he belonged to his stretch of wire, and the world kept on with its quiet. He worked another hour in that half-day where time is measured in the difference between a numb finger and a burning one. When he paused for breath, he found his eyes kept slipping to the same piece of hillside, the way a man checks an old scar without knowing he is doing it. Habit, not hope. The kind of cold that lives under a man's coat more than on it had worked its way in by then, a low hum in the ribs. He drew his scarf up and breathed through wool to wet it some. Warm air lies better on a face than dry to a point. He thought again about that porch light he did not have, and about the way an unlocked door sits in a man's head like a small mercy he can grant himself, without witness. Cloud thinned a little. The skin of the world went from gray to a mean silver. He turned the dun toward a corner brace he had meant to fix last week, and didn't. The brace had settled and the angle was wrong. Any steer with an itch would take it out in the first chin rub come spring. Boone set the horse to stand and went at the post with the maul. He drove a wedge, shifted the brace, felt things come up square. He grunted once and it fogged and went away. He was thinking of the way the stove door rang when it shut. The sound small but complete in the kind of room where a man counts his life in warm spells and walks in between them when it came. Not coyote, not hawk, not the creek, not the wire humming, high and tight when a gust plucked it like fiddle string. This was thinner, higher, and it threaded the wind instead of riding it. It came from the timber and from no place in particular, which is the worst sort of sound, one you can't point to with a finger. Boone turned his head, and the dun cocked an ear with him. The wind dropped half a step as if to listen too. The sound came again, a sliver of a cry, sharp and small and ragged at the edge, like cloth torn with cold hands. No animal makes that sound. He did not think, he did not speak. He set his cup back on the snowbank, laid the spoon across it as if to keep some promise with himself, and put his heel to the gelding's ribs. The fence would hold long enough. The world had shifted a fraction, and a man either moved with it or got left out in the weather. The dun took the timber like he knew what Boone meant, without a word. Snow came deeper under the trees, soft where wind had stacked it and brittle where cold had crusted the top. Boone eased the horse to a stop and listened again. The sound came thin and bright and broke off quickly, as if whoever made it was running out of the string they were tied to. He slid down. The ground gave to the ankle and held. He looped the reins once around a low limb so the dun could keep his head. No sense in snubbing a good horse hard in weather like this. He put his shoulder to the drifts and walked where the sound pointed, letting the timber close in until it felt like a roof. There was a cut through the trees, a bruise of a path nobody had ridden in days. The wind had laid it level, and the last of the prints had gone to a kind of memory in the snow, rounded, caved in. Not much to tell, but direction. He went that way, hands open, breath drawing in with a bite that told him what it always told him. Hurry makes poor work, and poor work kills. He saw the post, before he saw the woman. Old cottonwood that had no business still standing, half laced with rot and chewed by weather. A strand of barbed wire ran past, the kind a man sets because he intends to say where his world begins and ends. She'd been fastened to it like a warning, bare arms cinched behind her, wrists torn slick by the twists of wire, head bowed, hair gone stiff at the ends where the cold had taken it, skin the color a man's gets when blood is busy somewhere else. At her feet lay 3 small bundles that wouldn't have made one good armload between them. One moved with a weak, angry kind of life, pulling a whimper from somewhere ancient. The other 2 were quiet in a way Boone didn't like at all. He stepped in, slow enough to keep the cold from stealing his hands outright. The barbs had bitten deep. He could see where the steel had printed itself into her forearms, rust and blood-trading places. He set a boot heel against the post and got his knife under the wire where it bent. The blade was short and the steel was cold, and the work asked for more patience than a man with a heart could afford. But he made himself do it right. One twist let go, then another. When the last binding fell away, she didn't fall. She tipped, and he caught her, and she weighed less than a winter coyote. Her lips had fissured down to meat and gone dark at the cracks. He saw breath at her nose in the smallest cloud, and nothing at her mouth. He put his cheek to hers to make sure the heat was still in there somewhere. It was, but it was losing. He went to the babies. The rags they were wrapped in had once been something soft. Now they were stiff and wrong. He took the smallest first, because the smallest felt like a word that might be the last if a man didn't answer back. He tucked that one inside his coat, against his shirt, and felt a flinch of movement that could have been life or the cold trying to leave. The second he wrapped in his saddle blanket, twice around, then a third time, and tucked the ends under like he was laying kindling. The third he put in the crook of his elbow and drew his scarf across the face to keep the air from scalding the lungs. He set the woman down easy on the lee side of the post while he did that, and then lifted her, as if he was lifting the only thing the day would let him take. She made no sound. He put her weight high and close where men carry everything that matters. Back at the dun, he threw a wool over the horse's loins and ran a glove down each leg. Ice had formed in the frogs with that hard, glassy feel that will take a horse off his feet on a pitch. He lifted the near fore, thumbed the ice out, then the off fore, then both hinds, talking with his hands instead of his mouth. He dropped the latigo one hole and pulled it snug again. Leather shrinks in this kind of cold, and a loose cinch is a kind of sin. He checked the breast collar, set the skirts straight. He breathed once into the horse's mane and let the gelding smell him back. That made 2 of them that knew where the other was. He built a seat in the saddle by rolling the blanket tight behind the cantle and arranging the woman's weight forward of him. He put her across, not like a sack, but like a person, and threaded his arm through to hold her steady. The 2 blanket-wrapped babies he nested between them, one on either side of her ribs, where the heat could stack up. The smallest he kept inside his coat, up high so his breath could fall on her face and not freeze. He took his scarf and pulled it around the woman's ears until the wool made a met of sound. He found her hand, cold and swollen, and tucked it flat against his coat between the buttons where he could feel it, and she wouldn't lose it to the air. He took his hat off and put it back on her head for one breath, a foolish thing, then took it back and pulled her collar up instead. Pride makes a man do dumb things. Care sets it right. The dun stepped once, testing his feet like a dance learned slowly in another life. Boone put his heels to him, and the horse fell into a careful, high-headed gait that eats small country and keeps a man in the saddle when he is carrying more than himself. Snow came at them like thrown sand. The trees closed, opened, closed again. The sound of the wind went from howl to whistle, where the trunks narrowed the world. He leaned forward and put his chest to the woman's back so his breath would make a wall. The babies were quiet now, which is not always a good sign. He pressed his hand to each bundle in turn and felt the push of life answer, faint and stubborn, the way grass answers under a boot and springs back after. He did not tell them it would be all right. There is a kind of lie a man cannot afford to speak in a country where the weather listens. He said what a man says when the ground under his horse is thin and the light is thinner. "You're coming with me." It came out low and plain, made for the kind of ear that is hurt by all the other kinds. They broke out of timber into what passed for light. The wind met them full. The ridge showed the cabin not yet, because the ridge likes to hold its cards. He could feel the rise under the Dun's shoulders as the grade started, and he shifted his weight a hair to make the horses work a fraction less. He had half a mile of uphill drift between him and that stove door, with the sound he liked. He made a picture of that sound and set it like a lamp inside his head. The woman sagged once, and he pinned her with his forearm, gentle as he could, without letting gravity have her. He took a breath and found out he'd been skimping them, like a man poor with coins who keeps forgetting to spend. He gave his lungs the full, and it burned all the way to the bottom, but it gave him back something too. A scrape against his ribs told him the smallest had worked a hand free of his shirt. He took the tiny fingers and put them back under, against the warmth he was making. The second bundle stirred when the wind hit it, and he hunkered over it with his shoulder. The third made a sound like a bird that had learned how to be quiet for the sake of snow and wasn't sure if it should forget. The Dun found the old wagon ruts that pointed toward the place Boone kept his stove. They were full of drift and deceit, but a horse remembers lines the way a river remembers a bend. Boone let him choose, only stepping in when the wind had tricked the land into looking like something it wasn't. He kept to the swell of ground that he knew lay under the blank, where the snow couldn't drown him and the horse both. He looked at the line of the hills and brought up the shape of the cabin in his head, the way a carpenter will hold a wall before there's a nail in it. 4 walls, pitched roof, a door that complained when you took a mind to shut it. The stove had a voice like a sober man. If he could get her and those 3 handfuls of humans into that sound, he figured he would be ahead of whatever debt the morning had laid on him. There was no talking after that. He saved it for breathing and moving and feeling the bundles press back when he pressed. The sound of the wind made everything else small. Sometimes the blow went sideways, and sometimes it came head-on with a slap big as a hand. He let it have the hat brim and the coat shoulders. He kept the rest. He thought once of the pine wood spoon across the tin cup where he'd left it, the small bridge. He smiled without meaning to, and the wind took even that, and ground it fine and threw it toward the flats. The slope steepened right where it always did, because a mountain is nothing if not faithful. He took the Dun to the side where the drifts threw less shadow and more truth. The horse moved with that care you get from a good back and a cold day. Boone said nothing. Every step was a debt paid in full. The woman let out a sound that wasn't a word and might not have been for him. He pushed his arm up under her and lifted so her head wouldn't pitch. When the Dun did his work, he felt the line of her shoulder bone through the coat and wondered what kind of house had sent her out to meet wire and weather with nothing on her but a stubborn heart. He didn't measure the last 100 yards in yards. He measured them in the way the stove door would feel in his hand, and the way the fire would answer once. It had its say. He felt the ridge flatten under them, and knew he had bought a little time with what was left in him. The cabin showed then, white-shouldered and sullen in the blow, smoke-hole black as a closed eye. He put the Dun straight to the porch because the steps are for summer. The horse came to a stop with that small mercy only a good animal gives. stillness that feels like a hand you trust. Boone got down slow enough not to tear the world he was holding. He slid the woman into both arms, shifted the blanket bundles, made the smallest part of his coat into a cradle again, and took the door with his boot heel. The wood barked the way he liked. He stepped into the room and let the wind shove the door shut behind him. Half a mile of uphill drift lay in there, on his coat and in his bones. He carried it to the hearth and set it down, and started paying it back the only way a man can. Outside, the weather kept on with its old plan. Inside, a match wanted striking, and there were mouths to turn from blue to something like the color of life. Time thin to breathe, then to work. The rest would be fire and steady hands. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. The room met him with the blunt cold a place keeps when a fire's been out too long. The board said nothing, iron said less. He shouldered the door into its jamb and let the latch fall. The wind made one more try at the seams, found no argument it liked, and went off to bother the eaves. He laid the woman on the pallet by the stove. 2 quilts, 1 old army blanket, the clean corner saved for winter sickness. The bundled babies he set shoulder to shoulder in the curve of his coat, while he got the rest ready, using his body for a wall until the room could learn to be a room again. Kindling lived where it always did. Fat wood curls in a flour sack, split slivers of pitch pine stacked like prayer sticks, a twist of last summer's sage for smoke that behaves. He struck a blue tip from a corked bottle, cupped it, and fed the flame into the shavings. The fire took with that first dry crack that tells a man he won't be begging for it. He built it narrow and certain, air under, heat above, then set 2 lengths of jack pine along the back, so the iron would know what it was for. Stove talk began in a low tick, then a hum. He cracked the draft and slid the ash pan just enough to pull breath through. Heat climbed out of the iron like a hand finding its strength. He held his palms to it and turned them slowly, feeling the thaw, and then warn, and then turn to use. The babies made a restless sound that wasn't yet crying. He brought out the rabbit pelt basket from under the table, shook the dust hush out of it, and lined it fresh with a square of muslin. He laid them in one by one, lightest to the center where heat holds best. The smallest he set high and close, the other 2 tucked snug to either side, until they made one circle of quiet. A stoneware jug of goat's milk waited half buried in wood chips. Against the back wall where cold keeps things honest, he poured a measure into the Dutch oven, set it on the front plate, and watched for the first small steam. No hurry. Milk scalds when a man asks more of it than it knows how to give. He set a pinewood spoon and a tin dipper beside it, rubbed the spoon's bowl with his thumb till the grain shone. He knelt and checked the woman's breath. There was a whisper at her nose, the tiniest cloud that came and went with doubt. He pulled her collar straight, slid a folded quilt edge under the back of her neck so her head would lie kinder, and drew the quilts up to her throat. Her wrists were a mess where wire had spoken its piece. He'd wash and bind them when heat and milk had done the first job. The stove's heat began to push the room back into itself. He took the deep red Navajo shawl, shook off the travel cold, and laid it over the floorboards by the stove, then slid the basket onto the wool so the heat would come up through the weave. Color like that has a way of talking to a house. It said what was needed without noise. He reached for a small drawstring poke from the mantel, a thing most men would call foolish to keep. A smooth bone bead string polished by pocket years. He tied it to the basket's loop so it hung in the reach of small hands. The beads clicked soft, a sound with no sharp edges. One tiny fist found them by accident and held, as if the world might stop if it let go. Milk breathed at the edge of a simmer. Boone dipped a little to the tin, set the spoon in, and held a spoonful on the back of his hand. Heat walked in gentle, not cruel. He moved to the basket, slid a finger under a small chin, and let the first sip find a mouth. The smallest girl took it clumsy, then stubborn, then sure. He fed the second the same, waiting between sips for the swallow to finish, wiping the corner of a mouth with a fold of the muslin. The third came awake with a soft choke and settled when the spoon touched. The room gathered its senses around them. Outside, wind threw itself against the log ends and rolled off. Inside, the iron breathed. The milk sent up a clean sweetness, and the floor gave back a little of what feet had taken from it. He set the cup of warm milk by the stove edge where it wouldn't skin and went to the door, long enough to drag in the oat box with his boot. He scooped a measure into a pan and slid it outside onto the porch rail for the dun. He didn't show the horse his face. The animal would smell the oats and know the rest. Before he shut the door, he looked once into the blow. No figures in it yet, just the old world, hard at its same work. Back at the pallet, he pulled a bucket of snow chips from beside the door, set a kettle on to melt, and spread his roll of clean strips. Torn ticking he keeps for the kind of day men don't plan for. He warmed the cloth in the first melt and went to the woman's arms. Each touch he made like he was checking a new brand on another man's cattle. Deliberate, no claim, all truth. Blood lifted easy where it had dried. Wire prints stood in mean relief. He laid the warm cloth over the worst of it and wet the edges, then wrapped each wrist with 2 turns of ticking and a third for keeping. He didn't try to make it look like a miracle. Hands remember what's honest. The babies took to drowsing the way a good colt finds his feet after a spook, slow first, then sure. He fed them a second pass, listening for the swallow, counting the beats out of habit, 1, 2, and waiting for breath to answer. The smallest fussed at the spoon like a person with opinions. He liked that fine. He turned her toward the shawl, pressed the beads to her palm again, and watched her fingers close. He rose and banked the fire forward, pulled coals to the lip, laid 2 splits across and 1 on top to bridge. The stove ticked in satisfaction, then settled to its low talk. He felt heat at his face and at the backs of his hands, and at his throat where the scarf sat like a question half answered. He eased it down. The room had left off being an enemy. He took the woman's boots off, one at a time. Slow, careful with the weight of her ankles. Snow melt had made the leather mean. He stuffed each with crumpled paper from an old seed catalog and set them near the stove, not close enough to shrink, just close enough to remember the idea of dry. He lifted her feet and slid a folded blanket under her calves, so the pressure would not say ugly things to her bones while she slept. Her face, seen in firelight instead of winter's lies, had more to it than hurt. A line at the mouth that said she'd learned the cost of speech. Brow that had made a habit of watching doors. He let the seeing pass without naming it. Names carry weight, and she was already under more than her share. He took the tin and the spoon again and knelt to the basket. One by one he tipped warm, careful into patient mouths, until the small bodies answered by letting go. A hand opened and let the bead string fall, then found it again and tested its place. Breath from 3 small noses made 3 small fogs that rose and folded and were gone. He should have spoken, maybe. Men do in stories a person tells for comfort later, but he knew what rooms hear and what they don't, and he had no use for words that would have to be taken back or lived up to in a world that eats both for breakfast. He set his palm to the stove's side and felt iron gather itself. He opened the cooktop and set the Dutch oven a finger's breadth off the hottest ring so the milk would stay kind. He rolled his shoulders and felt the cold break in places he didn't know it had set. He took his hat off and stood it on the peg by the door, Steam lifted out of it like a spirit deciding to stay. He wiped the condensation from the inside of the window with a sleeve and looked out through the thin oval he made. The blow kept at it. The ridge was a simple dark behind a white argument. The porch rail wore a new hat. The oat pan was already feathered with snow, but a horse's muzzle had carved a clean circle in it, and that was comfortable enough for now. He latched the door back and went to the woman again. He set his forefinger under her jaw, felt the small thrum there, slow but not lost. He put the back of his hand to her cheek and left it a time so heat would learn the way in. Then he pulled the quilts higher still and tucked them against her neck with a fold that would not come loose when sleep argued. The basket gave a startle of sound as the smallest tested how the world worked now that it had learned a different answer. He leaned in, turned the bead string so the light caught it, and watched the eyes track. Not much light in there yet, but enough to mark the shine. He sat back on his heels and let the breath go all at once. The kind of tired that comes after a day that happened all inside 1 hour took him by the shoulders and reminded him he was a man built for meat and habit. He put a hand on the floor and felt the boards. The cold had left them. Warm weather was not yet through. In between is where most things get decided. He looked at the stove door and, without wanting to, smiled again at the sound it had made when he'd come through. A small, right sound. A thing closing the way it's meant to, with the world agreeing. He said it then, not to the room, not to himself, just to the line between what the wind owned and what a man could keep. Outside's storm, inside's a promise. No one answered, which was fine. The promise wasn't to someone, it was to the work. He filled the kettle again, set it to a low sit, and dug out the little tin of salve Doc Riley swore by for raw places. Bear grease and pine pitch and a smell like old courage. He set it near the back of the stove to warm so it would spread gently when it came time to use it. He cut more strips from a feed sack and rolled them into tight wheels a thumb wide. He laid everything in a neat row he could follow in the dark if he had to. He checked the babies, one by one, the soft weight of a palm on belly for rise and fall, a finger to the fontanelle to feel the drum of pulse, not rough, not timid. The first gave him a slow, satisfied wiggle. The second made a sound like a secret told to a friend. The third breathed out a long, thin note and, on the end of it, pinks from a pearly gray to a color with heat in it. A small mouth loosened, a fist unclenched. He watched it happen and felt something let go in his own chest that had been braced all the while without him knowing. He stood, joints speaking their age, and took one more length of split to the fire, laid it where it would take without complaint, and shut the stove door with that flat ring that says a thing is done right. The iron ticked, the wind sulked. The cabin remembered it was a shelter. He took the wash basin, now warm from the kettle, and set it by the pallet. He squeezed the cloth, steam rising, and put it to the woman's brow. Her skin didn't flinch from the touch. Some hurt runs so deep even relief has to ask permission. He waited the space of 3 breaths, and then drew the cloth down over the line of her cheek, to the corner of her mouth and along the jaw the wire had made a map of. The salve would come next, then sleep for all who could find it. He let his hand rest on the floor one last time, to feel the line cross from cold to near warm. The house had remembered the trick of it. He did not need more proof. He pulled the chair near the stove, turned it so he could see both the pallet and basket, and sat. He set his hat brim down on his knee and leaned his head back to the wall. Not to sleep, just to be in the same room with a fire that was doing its job and 3 lives that had decided to stay. Outside, the old world kept its old talk. Inside, he had made a different kind of weather, and just now, that was enough. The night didn't end so much as loosen. Fire made a slow country of the room. Edges came back first, then color. Then the small proofs a man trusts when he's lived by himself a long spell. Tin, winking, iron talking under its breath, the quilt's weight admitting it could be warm again. Boone sat in the chair, turned half to the stove, half to the pallet, hat brimmed down on his knee, hands open and close to heat. He had closed his eyes for a minute without meaning to. The kind of shut where a man can still count the ticks of iron and mark the breathing of those who need him. A sound changed. Not loud. A different kind of draw in the room, like a bow scraping softer on a string. He lifted his head. Her eyes were open. They weren't the sort that ask for pity, not first. They were the sort that take stock, same as he did at Graylight. The line of the rafters, the door's throw, the stove's honest talk. Who was sitting where and why? Fire took a lick of her cheek and set one small field of color there. It looked new and old in the same breath. She tried to lift a hand. The wrist said no, the arm said maybe. She flinched, not at him, but at the map the wire had left on her skin, an involuntary wince a body makes when it recognizes itself and doesn't like the seeing. Boone stood, not quick. The chair scuffed the plank in a way that won't scare horses or women. He stepped to the wash basin, wrung out a cloth warmed on the kettle, and set it on her forearm with the weight of a feather. She watched his glove come off, the hand come on, big, rope-burned, nicked white in places where time had filed the corners down. He didn't say anything. His eyes met hers and held as long as a handshake, and no longer. The babies let out that thin, contented murmur that belongs only to rooms where fire has made a stand. The smallest of the three had one fist twisted in the bone bead string Boone had tied to the basket. The beads clicked once when she turned her wrist. The sound made the woman's face move, something like a startled gratitude that doesn't know which way to run. She blinked. It took effort. Her lips were split fine as old porcelain, and when breath passed them, it made the smallest stick. Boone set the cloth to her mouth and let a line of warm water go there, just enough to tell the skin a new idea. He reached to the stove shelf, pinched a whisper of salve on a finger, and touched the cracks with the care a man saves for guns and babies and old horses, gone tender in spring. Her gaze left his hand and went to the basket. The three slept in a way that told the room they meant to go on doing it. Her throat worked, no sound yet. He saw the name gather behind her teeth like a rider sizing up a river. He waited. Her right hand, bandaged, swollen some, slid from under the quilt an inch and drifted toward the pinewood spoon resting on the stove's edge, then pulled back as if she'd reached for something that didn't belong to her. The spoon wasn't much. Handle worn smooth, the bowl rubbed to a dull shine by years of work, but a person's life can make a shrine of small tools. He set the spoon closer to the basket without comment, as if it had been there all along. He put the cloth back in the basin, wrung it slow, and offered it to her fingers like a truce. She took it, not from him, from the room. She pressed it against the line of her jaw where the cold had laid claim. The steam lifted and ran along her cheekbone and then away. It left a wet track that was not a tear and not far from one. When he stepped back, she reached for the bone beads instead. The string made a soft clack against her palm. She held on as if the room would drift if she didn't pin a corner to herself. Her eyes moved from the beads to the babies and back, like a woman learning a landscape she already knew by heart. Her voice came in pieces, first the breath, then the grit, then the sound, carried on what strength the fire and the cloth and his quiet had made for her. May Beth? It was hardly more than 2 syllables. He heard the work it took to bring them through the cracks. He saw the fear that the room would make a judgment, hard, final, of the kind that sticks worse than any winter. He nodded once, A man's, yes. Nothing added. Calder, she managed after the long ride between. Wren. For that. She said the names like they were obligations paid late. He gave her back the same thing he'd given the fence that morning. Sound work? No talk. He folded the quilt edge under her shoulder so the cloth wouldn't rub wrong and set the basin where her hand could reach it again without asking him. Her eyes did that thing grief teaches people. Avert, seek, avert. They glanced at his face and away to the fire, to the babies, to the spoon, to the door, then back to him with a look that measured what he was built of. She didn't find a preacher in him or a judge, just a man with heat at his back and work in his hands. It seemed to be enough. She tried another word and the breath snagged. He raised his hand, palm down, a little, not to hush her, to set the pace. His voice came low and even like a plumb line. You didn't ask, I ain't asking back. Her mouth twitched at that. Not a smile, not yet. The thing people make when the world gives them a space as big as their own name and nothing else. He moved to the basket and checked the smallest. The spoon met that small mouth with a practiced patience. 2 sips. A pause, a counting. 1, 2 for the swallow. The girl's hands opened and closed on the beads with a focus that didn't belong to animals. He set the spoon down where the fire's warmth would keep it honest. She watched his hands, not the kind of watching that takes or weighs or writes a story it plans to tell later, the kind that learns. A woman who had been told too long that care is a favor and not a trade. Her fingers drifted again in the direction of the spoon, then drew back halfway and hung there. She nodded to herself. So small he could have missed it if he'd been a man who looks only at his own work. Permission. Not from him. From her. He turned to the kettle and poured a finger of warm water into a dented tin cup. Set it to cool. Folded a cloth and dipped it, then wrung it till it stopped pretending to be wet. He held it until she reached. She did. Her knuckles brushed his, and he made nothing of it except to shift his hand so she could take the cloth easier. The iron ticked a faster tune, heat settling where cold had squatted. The window wore a soft blur where someone's sleeve had cleared it earlier. A winter fly, the color of ash, drifted out from under a sill and crawled to a place it didn't belong anymore and found it belonged there after all. That's what rooms do when you ask them with fire. She lay there and breathed. The breath wasn't strong, but it was even. Every few counts her eyes went to the babies, and every time they found what they were looking for without having to ask. A mother's work is mostly counting and counting again in a language that has no numbers. He could feel words gathering in the room, the kind that want to tell how such a thing came to be. He put them aside the way a man sets a tool he doesn't need yet. One thing, then the next, then the next. That's how winter gets beat. He cut a new strip from the sackcloth and rewrapped one wrist where the first binding had wept through. He did it the way Doc Riley had showed him, firm enough to tell the blood where to stay, soft enough not to argue with bone. The salve had melted to a spreadable courage on the back of the stove. He set a thin line of it where the skin had taken a wrong idea and needed reminding. She watched without flinching. People who expect pain know better than to lie to it. The stove's hum made a frame for the room. Outside, the wind had gone from a fight to a sulk. The door had that settled look he liked, set true to the jam. The air carried a line of goat's milk, pine pitch, wet wool. Smells a person's body recognizes as shelter even when their head is not sure. Her eyes found his again. There was a question in them that wasn't nosy, not who he was or why he'd done this, but whether this minute would be allowed to stand, or if some older, harder plan would come through the door and throw it aside. He held her look and let the answer be the look itself. He reached and pulled the Navajo shawl closer under the basket's edge where a draft had snuck in. The red went deeper in the firelight. The babies sighed in a three-part chord and adjusted their living like little river stones shifting under fresh water. She let out air that had been trapped somewhere under her ribs since wire. It made a sound almost like a laugh if a person had forgotten what laughing was. He didn't follow it. He gave it space enough to be what it was. Minutes went in that good way, counted but not hoarded. He took the spoon again, made one more pass, and wiped a bead of milk from the corner of a small mouth with the edge of his sleeve. He straightened, put his hand to the stove's side, then brought it back to his own chest as if to check both of them were still where he'd left them. Her head turned on the folded quilt. The motion cost her. It paid back more than it took. She looked at the door a long beat, then at him, then at the fire, then at the basket. She didn't say thank you. The room had already decided that was settled. Firelight thinned where the east would be if the logs had windows that understood directions. The cabin shifted like timber does when it stops being iron cold and remembers it is in fact wood. Somewhere high, a beam moved a hair and made a sound you could mistake for a small rap if you were the sort to sleep heavy. Then came it, the soft knock. Not wind, not the stove. The kind of sound a door makes when weather and warmth argue just enough to loosen a hinge, or a loose latch answers the change with a polite suggestion. It was easy, and it was there, and it asked nothing but being noticed. Boone turned his head toward it and kept still, the way you do when you don't yet know if a sound belongs to wood or to a person. The fire held. The babies breathed. Her eyes went to his, asking without speaking what he knew and what he meant to do. He set the spoon down quietly, palmed the chair back to give the floor his weight, and drew one slow breath that had heat in it. The room waited with him. Day was thinking about showing itself. Whatever was at the door, latch, timber, or more than that, would be met by a man awake. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. The knock that had come soft went nowhere. Boone listened into it until he could hear the truth of it. Wood easing as the room took heat. A latch settling into a place it hadn't liked all night. He let the door be and set the room back to its breath. Iron humming low, milk warming slow, quilts lifting and falling with what they meant to keep. Dawn arrived thin as tin, the kind that doesn't promise anything, just stands outside and waits to see if you'll open the door. Boone didn't. He moved instead to the shelf where a short whetstone lived in a tobacco tin, sloshed a thumb of warm from the kettle into the lid, and set steel to grit. Knife on wet stone makes a sound a man can lay his day against. Long pull, even return, no hurry. You don't ask a blade for more than it can give, or it'll leave you when you need it. The stroke drew her eyes. Maybeth lay still, bandaged wrist on the quilt, face turned toward the sound. In that rasp and hush, a room finds a tempo small enough for hurt to keep. He didn't look over, not yet. He let the knife teach the edge what true was, then wiped it, oiled it, and set it where a hand could find it without fuss. The babies held the kind of sleep you can trust, warm-bellied, loose-fingered. The smallest kept the bone beads trapped in her fist, jaw working from dreams. Lila, the middle one, if a man can call such a thing from size and habit, had turned so the firelight wrote itself across her cheek. Made a small smile that wasn't for anyone, just a lesson her face remembered from before cold. Mercy, the quiet one, lay, so even you had to lay a palm on the rise of her, to know life was taking steady account. He rinsed a cloth and laid it on Maybeth's forearm. She watched his hand, then the steam, then the cloth sink to skin. Something in the eyes changed, not the color, the way the light took to them. Fire does that for folks, gives a different answer back. When her voice came, it wore gravel and winter both. He didn't push it toward sentences. He let it come as it would, like water finding the known path in thaw. She didn't say names for a while and didn't paint pictures bigger than she could lift. The story was smaller, meaner, and it fit the room because truth does, however ugly. The gist came in the spaces between breaths and in the way her mouth fought the splits. A cattle drive gone wrong the spring before, late thaw, early stampede, river high and bad with rolled trees. Voss had overbought, undercounted weather, lost weight on the trail and more at the scales. He'd borrowed against his name, and the next calving told the bank the range would pay it back with interest and a son to sign on the line. A boy looks like collateral to certain men. A boy makes a man stand taller in a room that measures by height and rumor. 3 girls had put him shorter than he could stomach. Brothers who watched him like a fence watches a bull had smirked just enough to cook a man's pride to leather. Pride, cut cheap with debt, turns to something sharp in the hand. He'd taken the blade to the nearest soft thing. Wire will do what it's told. She didn't talk about the night outside, how it began, who tied the first loop, where the rags came from. Some things are winter that way, too white to tell. She did say what she was most afraid of, and it wasn't weather. Tongues. The kind that sit in a churchyard or a store and make law because the brand inspector happens to drink his coffee at the same stove. Useless, those tongues would say. No air, no help, 3 mouths. She didn't put the words in the air, but the air knew them anyway. Rooms save what people think they hide. Boone let the talk land where it would. He reached to the basket without looking away and eased the beads so they clicked once. Fern, he didn't know the girls' names yet, but a man learns by behavior, took the sound and drifted deeper under it, mouth gone soft on sleep. Lila's eyes blinked open and found the fire and decided it was a good thing to watch. Mercy made the small, sober move of turning her face into the shawl, as if to keep what warmth had cost to make. Maybeth's lips tried a hard word and split for the trouble. He dipped the cloth, wrung it to just warm, and pressed it to the corner of her mouth, till the skin remembered it could be kind. He set his hand, scarred knuckles, old rope burns, over hers where it lay trapped under ticking. The line of her shoulder eased a notch. The room, which had been listening close, seemed to take a breath with her. He gave her back the only thing a man like him can give, when a story lays all its hurt on the blanket between you. A plain sentence put down like a fence post you don't plan to move. Round here, those girls are the only thing worth feeding. He didn't dress it. He didn't look to see what it did. A word that's true doesn't need a face to prove it. Something like weather changed behind her eyes, not the storm ending. The first stillness after it's broken a country and gone on. Her hand, receiving heat where his palm had set it, flexed once inside the binding and let the cloth have some of the shake it had been saving. Mercy chose that moment to find his finger. He felt it before he looked. Tiny grip, full claim. No ask. He slid his finger sideways so the bone beads wouldn't catch her wrist and let her hold as hard as she wanted. Lila lifted one hand and put it toward light. Fire made what it always makes, shapes, in a pattern no one can quite keep. She smiled again for that. Fern, mouth still on the beads, blew a small bubble of spit that went and did what bubbles do, which is make a sound that tells a man winter won't have everything it wants. He went back to the stone once, 2 passes, then none. The knife was ready, and so were the strips of cloth. He worked salve into the places on her forearms, where wire had told lies and skin had believed. He wrapped and tied, wrapped and tied, the way Doc Riley had taught him, with a strip pulled just tight enough to say no to swelling and yes to blood. He didn't tell her it'd heal clean. Truth is better. It'll heal like it means to, and your hands will carry that map for a while. The room had settled into a kind of measure. Stove doing its low talk, milk keeping its warm careful, timber forgetting cold, babies finding their own time again. He thought briefly of the flats, the store with the sticky counter where Nettie Mae kept a ledger that never once let a child leave without candy or a man without guilt. He thought of the brand inspector who'd learned to listen when money talked and weather didn't. He thought of Voss standing taller than he should on what didn't belong to him, and of a paper claim that could be waived like law until law stood up on its own 2 feet. He set all that aside. A man only carries what's in the room. The rest comes when it comes. Minutes passed in a decent order. He took the pinewood spoon, fed tiny sips to each child, wiped the corners of mouths with the hem of his shirt where it was clean, turned the bead string so a small palm could find it. Maybeth rested in the small patient's firebys. The bandages took the shape of her and held. The light at the window went from pewter to a dull nickel. Snow still walked the ridge. Wind had given up on the boards and moved its argument back to the trees. Boone stood to stretch the long bones, felt the pull in his bad shoulder, and took it. For the old friend it was. The knock, real this time, didn't ask to be believed. It came firm, 2 taps and a third, that said the hand belonged to someone with a horse cooling in the lee of the cabin, and a reason to be here that wasn't about pleasantries. Boone set the spoon down, crossed to the door, and opened it the width of his palm. Morning blew a handful of cold in, and took a look around the room over his shoulder like it had the right. He blocked it with his body and the door both. Nettie Mae Hollis stood on the stoop, cheeks high with ride-burn, green sweater rimed with a lace of frost, breath fogging and curling back around her hat brim. Behind her, a sorrel mare worked the bit and blew steam like she was telling the day to move along. She didn't waste talk on hello. She didn't try to look past him, either. She kept her eyes on his and let the rest be the room's business until invited. She had word. He could see it in the way her jaw set, in the fold of paper pinched tight in her glove, in the frost clinging to the wool, like sugar left too long on a biscuit. A claim had been posted. His mind supplied the facts before her mouth did. Ezekiel Voss's name in tall letters. Talk of property and by right. The brand inspector's small scrawl where it shouldn't be. 4 riders hired who didn't travel to bring anybody home gentle. They'd be tracking uphill soon as the weather gave a man leave. Boone opened the door enough to bring her inside the windbreak, but not into the room itself. He didn't need the cold on those small lungs any more than it had already taken. Nettie caught his meaning and stepped into the pocket of Lee without crossing the line where a stove does what law can't. She didn't hand him the paper. She didn't need to. News that heavy reads itself into a man. He nodded once, the same way he'd nodded to Maybeth when she'd laid her truth on the quilt. Nettie's mouth pressed thin, then let a breath go she'd been keeping since the flats. He reached for the latch. Behind him, fire held, babies breathed, and a woman with bandaged wrists watched without flinching. Outside, the mare tossed her head, as if to say the trail wasn't done with any of them. The day had changed shape. The work would follow it. He set the door. The room kept its promise. The ridge would not. Nettie didn't come in. She stepped just out of the wind and let the warmth wash her face, then handed Boone a small burlap poke, a twist of paper, and a flat bottle that had worn the shape of someone's palm for years. Lentils, jerky, a nip of fire. She kept her gloves on. Cold does not care for ceremony. He set the poke on the table without looking at what was inside and stood so his shoulder filled the crack of the door. Her sorrel blew and pawed twice, then settled. Frost had feathered Nettie's green sweater to a pale lace. When she breathed, it came white, and then turned clear as if even air didn't want to stay outside long. He didn't ask for the paper. She didn't offer. Word doesn't need ink to weigh what it weighs. The brand inspector's scrawl, Voss's tall letters, the part where men make property out of people and call it tidy, all that lived in the set of her jaw. He nodded once. She answered with a smaller one and the hitch in her mouth. That means a person is carrying someone else's trouble on purpose. She leaned sideways, not stepping in, and peered toward the basket without making a noise of it. 3 small proofs lay on wool. Warmth, breath, the solemn work of living. She reached 2 fingers in the distance and smoothed Mercy's brow like she might a foal's forelock, careful not to touch skin she hadn't been invited to. Then, because Nettie keeps her books straight even when the world doesn't, she slid a nickel under the pine wood spoon on the stove shelf and left it there, heads up. Down payment on thanks. The kind that doesn't embarrass anybody. She had a plan, and in a place like this, plans look like chores. She'd ride back to the store, put the sorrel under the lean-to with a nosebag, shake the ice from the pump, and wire Sheriff Kincaid in the county seat. But distance is slower than men on fresh horses, and a storm's mercy is crooked. So she added 1 more stitch to the seam between them. If she saw smoke from Boone's Ridge in a pattern that wasn't cook fire, long draw, short draw, she'd throw the key to the telegraph and send again, louder. She didn't say the sentence out loud that he heard anyway. I see you. I'll stand where I can be seen back. Nettie turned, set her boot to the stoop like a woman who knows her weather, and went into it without making a case about it. The door took the latch the way a good hand takes a rope. Clean. Done. Boone slid the bar that lived across 2 pegs he'd set himself. Oak rubbed smooth where his palm ran it, summer and winter, and then drove a wedge into the jamb where the wood had shrunk and gone dishonest. The room kept its warm. He let the bar sit there like a short piece of law. Work followed work. Bracing comes before courage in winter. He crossed to the back wall, pulled a crate from under the shelf, and began moving stores to the root cellar. Flour tied tight in ticking, a sack of beans that had outlived 3 seasons of hands, salt kept in a blue jar with a cracked lid, a coffee tin of .44 cartridges wrapped in oiled cloth, a second tin of fishhooks, and 2 needles finer than any ranch hand has a right to. He set the goat's milk jug deeper in the shadow where cold held but didn't bite. The rabbit pelt basket he eased closer to the iron's talk and turned so the bone beads lay where a small hand would find them every time without thinking. Maybeth watched without cost to him. Her eyes tracked the order of it, not from suspicion, from the relief of seeing the world take a shape that wasn't for hurting. He checked her bandages and let the stove's steam do what it could. Her breathing had found a count and kept to it. Outside, the wind had traded howl for wet, the kind of morning that glazes edges and turns the snow's top to a slick skin. He shrugged into his coat, pulled his hat low, and stepped to the porch long enough to string a guide rope. A man thinks of it before he needs it, or he won't have it when he does. He took a coil of grass rope from a peg and hitched one end with a clove to the porch post, chest high. He walked it to the nearest stand of pines, paying it out steady, and set a turn around a trunk. Then another, knocking notches with his belt knife at each tree, so a hand in a whiteout will know the next is coming. Every 6 paces he tied a hand loop, big enough for a fist in mittens, tight enough not to sag and lie. At the far end he tied on a thin strip of tin. When the wind worked it, it made a small rattle, just enough to tell a person the rope had finished being a line and started being a bell. He checked the dun, blanket snug, ice picked from the frogs, a hand along the loin, under the wool. To be sure, heat was holding where it should. He slung a scoop of oats into the shallow pan on the lee side and tucked a bit of jerky under the rim. Horses like a man's salt same as men do. He thumped the shoulder once, thanks, plain, and the gelding answered with a blink that said, "This will do." Back inside, he dragged a second crossbar to the door and set it on the lower. Pegs he'd driven last fall when the first blizzard reminded him that wind is a poor neighbor to trust. He cut wedges for the rear window's sash, tapped them till the rattle quit, and stacked wood shoulder high on the inside where weather can't plan for it. He left a path clear to the root cellar trap and chalked a small mark on the floorboards where a man can find the ring in dark without his eyes. He built a smudge kit the way his father had, a coffee can punched with air holes, a twist of grease-soaked rag, 2 hands of green bough. He set it by the back step under a lidded crate. If he had to, the smoke would talk louder than the stove could, and Nettie's wire would carry the rest. The breast of the day rose and fell. He fed the girls with the spoon, one after the other, keeping the count that turns chaos into living. 1 small sip, 2 heartbeats, swallow. He rewarmed the shawl by holding it across his own knees a while before tucking it back around the basket. Maybeth's hands, bandaged to the knuckles, lay quiet atop the quilt. Her eyes worked. Fear of tongues leaves late, if at all. But room after room she tested. Stove, door, his back bent over a rope, and none of them lied to her. He went outside again when the wind tired of itself, and the gray had turned to a pewter that passes for noon in January. He ran the guide rope a second length, this one from the porch to the woodpile and on to the outhouse, because a man does not tempt winter with brave ideas about how long his body will wait. He tied each loop like a prayer and pulled each knot down with the back of his wrist, the way old hands do who trust, feel more than sight. When he came in, he pulled the bar and swung the door a hand's width to let the day show itself. Nothing on it but weather. He shut the door and set the bar again. The sound was small law made of oak and a man's will, to keep his promises the size he can carry. He brought down a basket of potatoes and a clutch of onions from the cellar and set them near the stove. He put a handful of lentils to soak in a blue bowl Nettie had sold him for near nothing last summer and told him the price was on account of it not holding hope any more. The bowl held, anyway. Everything does or doesn't for reasons stores don't write down. Through it all, he kept the count. Babies, fire, door, rope, woman's breath, weather's mood. He turned the spoon to the clean side before setting it down every time. Small decencies scratch their own tally marks in a day. Nettie's sorrel came back once in his ear, a far-off snort that could have been any horse in any draw, and then the ridge took the sound away and left only wind. Afternoon laid itself thin over the mountains, a silver coat on old bone. Snow that had been a fist opened to a flat hand. The timber threw long shadows, and the drifts held their breath like they were deciding which way to fall. Near late light, Boone stepped out to the porch with the cup. He'd set back on the snowbank at first work. The spoon still bridged it like a little truss against bitterness. Nettie's nickel winked under the handle, where firelight and day took turns at it. He stood there long enough to feel the rope cut a straight line through the gray and tell him he was where he meant to be. He looked down slope along the seam of the switchback, far off, where an old drift wore a hard crust, a row of dark ovals pressed into the pallor, and ran out of sight. Not one horse, not 2, 4. The storm had skinned their edges, but the weight told the tale. Men had turned their mounts uphill with the kind of purpose no weather argues out of them. He didn't bring the news inside. He didn't have to. Rooms here with their own wood. He reached and touched the rope once, the way a man lets himself touch a rail before he crosses a trestle. Then he went back in, set the bar, and fed the fire like he meant to have it when night came. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Nettie's sentence still hung in the doorway, where the cold had come and looked and left. Wind'll skin a man quicker in debt. He's comin'. The day tipped into evening. The little stove kept its low talk. The girls breathed their three-voiced hymn. Outside, the ridge squared its shoulders for the next thing. Inside, the rope ran from promise to pine, and every knot knew what it was tied for. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Late light thinned to a color that makes men walk softer without knowing why. Boone stood with his palm on the door bar and felt the cabin's heat through the oak. The ridge had gone quiet in the way a yard does when it's fixing to hold court. He slid the bar free, opened the door enough to take a look, and let the cold shoulder past him without granting it a right to stay. Down the switchback, four shapes shouldered into the wind till the wind gave way. Broad brims crusted white, coats gone stiff at the hem where sleet had worked them, horses stepping carefully not from fear, from the sort of schooling you get when men ride you into weather on purpose. They came at an angle that let a man count them twice without taking his eyes off the line of their hands. Boone did the count once. 4. Good mounts. Sore miles, not much patience left in either flesh or leather. He shut the door to a hand's width and turned back to the room. The rabbit pelt basket sat where the Navajo shawl could send heat up through the weave. 3 small breaths wrote themselves in fog on the air, then quit the writing and went back to living. Maybeth's eyes met his. He didn't put words to the look. He tucked the quilt edge firmer under her shoulder, set the pinewood spoon on the stove shelf bowl side down, and laid the bone bead string where a fist would find it without hunting. He touched the latch, felt the bar's weight with the back of his fingers, then took neither. Doors answer to timing same as cattle. He stepped out and pulled the door to behind him till the latch kissed home. Not slammed, not soft. A sound with a job in it. His boots made no case in the snow. He took the porch boards with an even weight and stood where the eave broke the sleet, and the step gave him ground. No gun on his hip. Hands empty, shoulders loose the way a man keeps them when he means to put his back into something if he has to. The 4 drew up 3 horse lengths off the stoop and let the weather finish talking first. Scarves came down, mouths showed winter beards, and the kind of smile men wear when they mistake numbers for law. One of them had a paper folded twice and stiff with frost in his glove, ink making men out of words they didn't write. Another wore the look of a man who enjoys being second to the worst idea in the outfit. The third had a new hat he wished he hadn't bought because storms and pride don't share well. The one in front did the speaking, which is to say he let the air know who thought he was owed something. Claims got said, not loud, not polite, the sort of language that turns people into property and asks the fence to agree. In it rode the brand inspector's name like a borrowed badge, and Voss's tall notion of himself hanging off the back of it. Boone listened without crossing his arms or narrowing his eyes. Winter makes a show of stillness. A man can borrow some and not be caught at it. When they ran out of sentence, he gave the cold, the courtesy of one quiet breath. He did not spit. Men who need a crowd spit. He spoke the thing that needed saying plain, no weight on it except the weight of it being true. Told them that woman had never been the man's to begin with, and she was sure as hell not the hands standing in his yard. The wind shifted like a horse setting a new foot. Hat brims tugged, the horses blew and stamped because even animals get tired of listening to paper talk. The front rider leaned on the idea of stepping his mount closer, then thought better of asking Ice to hold his temper for him. Boone did not move. There are times a man shrinks his world to a door and a threshold, and a promise running between them, and this was one. The rider with the paper tried again. Words about right, retrieval. wives that belonged this, and children that belonged that. He held the folded sheet like it could bite Boone for him. Boone set his eyes on the space between the man and the horse, and kept them there till the man's jaw found out it wasn't the strongest thing in the yard. He raised his voice only enough to clear the wind, and no more. "Test it, boys, bring a shovel." The kind of line that tells a man where to stand if he means to die, or think. It landed without echo and sat there, like a fence post, driven to frost line. The second rider made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been January. The first shifted in the saddle and looked past Boone to the door as if the wood would tell him a different story than the man did. Wood keeps better company than that. Silence came on the yard, good and heavy, court quiet. The men saw what they saw. An empty porch, a man whose hands were made of work and not talk, a door that belonged to him the way a stirrup does, when both of you have done your share of miles. They weighed weather and pride and the cost of finding out how deep a man will dig when he tells you to bring a shovel. They didn't break the standoff so much as step off of it. The front hand turned his mount with the reins and not his heels, a small tell on what kind of rider he was, and the other three let their horses find the same piece of ground without showing too much hurry. No man looked away first, but all of them left looking like they'd written this place down in their heads in a script that said later. Snow had thickened in the last few breaths. The sleet went to pellets, then to knives, then to that close, suffocating fall that makes the whole world a white lie. Boone watched them take the switchback down into it, the line of their backs set to return when the sky had a different color. Hoof noise fell apart, and then quit. Their eyes had left a date on the yard without a day to it. He filed it where he kept other due bills. He stood a moment more with his breath a small cloud and the rope thrumming beside him like a string pulled by a patient hand. He put his palm to the porch post and felt the cold going in and the heat coming out and the balance between them the size of a man's say-so. Then he put his hand to the latch and eased the door shut behind him, not to hold them out, to hold the promise in. Inside, the stove talked low and pleased. 3 small bodies went on with the slow work of choosing to stay. Maybeth's eyes were open and steady, listening for what the wood would tell her about the world outside. He set the bar, oak to iron. The sound made a small border around the room, drawn with a straight edge and not much ink. He walked to the window, cleared a round of frost with the heel of his palm, and watched the ridge take the last of the 4 shapes into itself. The weather heeled over right there, wind turning quarter, pressure falling in his bones like a sentence he'd heard before, a real blow coming, the kind that forgets men and remembers timber. He turned from it without hurry and checked the counts he kept: fire, door, rope, milk, bandage, breath. Outside, January set its jaw. Inside, the room held still enough for the next thing. The weather set its jaw, and then, as if it had said its piece for the hour, eased enough to let a man hear his own hands again. Boone took the lull the way a stockman takes a clean gate, quiet, matter of fact, no brag in the way he moved through it. He cleared a place on the table where light lived best, and laid out a short plank he'd sawn from a windfall in cottonwood the summer before. Pale wood, soft-grained, the kind that takes a knife like it means to remember what you write in it. He chalked 3 lines with a carpenter's stub, breathed on his fingers, and set the blade to work. Shavings came off in long, curly tongues and fell against the deep red Navajo shawl he'd folded over the table to keep the board from skating. The red made a field for the pale curls, snow and sunset. He carved slow, letters first, then the little strokes that keep a name from drifting. The stove talked low. The pinewood spoon lay across the pot to keep steam honest. In the basket, the 3 girls settled into their own map of the world. Mercy steady as a held note, Lila turning her face to the light as if it were a story, Fern mouth working the bone beads, their soft clack like a cricket who'd found winter tolerable. Every so often Boone stopped the knife mid-stroke and turned his head to the basket, a ranch hand's ear counting breaths, the way he'd count cattle on the drift, not afraid of loss, just unwilling to be late to it. Maybeth lay on the pallet, but not so flat as before. The bandages on her wrists were clean, edges tucked the way a careful man tucks a blanket around a colt that doesn't yet know it's worth the covering. She watched the knife without speaking, the way people watch rain after long dry, cautious, grateful, not trusting their luck enough to name it. After a while she let a sound out under her breath, a humming, with no words to it. It came from a place behind the hurt, and walked itself toward the fire. The tune was old enough to have belonged to somebody else once, maybe a mother with a kettle and a window and a winter of her own. The knife found the end of mercy and went on. Lila, then Fern, a careful hand lining each letter so the light would sit down in it and stay. Boone wiped the blade on a scrap and dipped 2 fingers in a tin of linseed oil he kept for tool handles. He rubbed the letters till the grain woke and the names came up out of the board with a kind of quiet pride Wood learns from long standing. Oil made the room smell like summer in a barn. A shadow crossed the door's window, no knock, just a shape with sense. Boone lifted the latch and pulled the door half open into the pocket of warmth. May Ellison stood there with her shawl up and a satchel tucked to her side, face rosy from a ride that had been more thing than willingness. She was the sort who made 2 miles look like one and never let you see how she'd done it. She held out a wrapped parcel with her gloved hands and didn't angle her body to look in. Folks who respect rooms know how to stand at the threshold and stop. He took the parcel, a slate, thin and black, with the chalk tucked in a rag. "Found 2 in the schoolhouse box," she said, words quick so they wouldn't freeze. "Young'uns always use one up before the winter's done." She dipped her head once, not to him, to whatever was breathing behind him, and stepped back into the white. The mare turned on a tight rein. The wind got between them, and then she wasn't there. He set the slate on the mantel where the nickel Nettie had left, winked under the spoon handle, then went back to the board. The letters had settled into themselves. He drilled 2 small holes with a handawl and threaded rawhide through, knotting it close. When he hung the name board over the basket, the room changed the way a corral changes when you put salt out. Quiet first, then a small, correct bustle of attention. The girls didn't know their names from any other marks in Wood, but their bodies knew the truth of being named. Mercy flexed her fingers around the beads and then let go a little. Lila squinted at the letters like she'd seen them somewhere before. Fern's hum went up a half note for no reason Winter could give. Boone went to the stove and poured the day's second boil across a grounds that had learned how to try again. He braced the pinewood spoon across the cup and let the steam run. Words were getting loose in the room, the kind that time says and people pretend are theirs. He didn't mind them, not now. He set the cup down, turned, and found Maybeth watching him like a person looking for the edge of a map. It came out of her before she could measure it, soft as the breath that carried it. Harlan Boone. The full of it, not a question, a calling in. The way a range rider says a horse's name when both of them have just climbed something they had no right to. He didn't answer with anything you could. Write down. He lifted the cup and took a sip and set it back slow, as if the room needed to see the motion to agree with it. He broke the quiet with a line strong enough to bear weight and plain enough not to bruise. Coffee stays hot. Folks talk don't. He wasn't aiming at her with it. He was aiming at the space above the stove, where weather and rumor like to shake hands. The sentence landed and then sat, a small bench the room could rest on, without committing to more. He took the spoon and fed the girls in turn, the way he always did, sip, count, swallow, then set the spoon down with the bowl turned away from dust and reach. Maybeth lifted the slate from the mantel, thumbed the chalk out of its rag, and drew a line along the bottom corner. It made a sound like ice under a boot. Her wrists said to take it slow. She did. On the first try, the chalk broke and rolled under the stove. On the second, she made a mark you could call a letter if you were patient. She smiled at it a little like a person who's found a creek under snow. Not surprised it was there, just glad it still ran. Boone dragged a chair to the table and set a scrap of cottonwood on it for her elbow, a prop so her hands wouldn't have to prove anything to the world but their intent. She drew 3 shapes, simple as fence corners, M, L, F. Her mouth said nothing, but her eyes said a great deal to the 3 names hung above the basket. The letters weren't pretty, they were true. The weather outside remembered itself. A deep, belly-born creek came down through the rafters where roof meets sky, the kind of talk boards make when storm snow shoulders the house and asks the ridge what it means to keep a line. The draft fluttered the shawl's fringe and set the bead string clacking twice like a traveling man, rapping knuckles on a storefront window. Boone went to the door and laid the back of his hand to the seam. The pressure had dropped. Any ranch hand with a bad knee would have sworn to it. He reached up and set the top latch so the wind wouldn't jiggle it into a lie. The board above the basket caught the new light, if you could call it light, and held it in the letters. Mercy, Lila, Fern, 3 names that wouldn't wait a wagon by themselves, and yet the house felt heavier with them up there, in a way that made the floor sound right underfoot. Maybeth eased back onto the pallet and let the chalk rest on the slate's edge. Her eyes had that odd shine you get when a thing hurts and helps in one motion. Boone took the name board with his palm, pressed it once the way he might test a post set true, and felt the wall answer, sound. He banked the stove toward evening, cross-split bridge log draft down to a hum, and set a pot of lentils to take on water like a slow promise. The pinewood spoon went back to its post across the rim. The Navajo shawl, having done its day's work of color and warmth, lay drying on a peg by the door where it bled its red back into the air dot. The bone beads kept time under Fern's fist until sleep took them both. Outside, wind arrived with purpose, shouldered up against the eaves, and took hold. The rope Boone had run between porch and pines thrummed once, twice, then laid down to a steady note like a string tuned to weather. The mountain's smell changed. Metal, wet wool, a clean threat. He drew a long breath and put it away, where he keeps the knowledge that saves minutes later. The room had its pieces set, names on wood, letters chalked, spoon-bridged, shawl red in the corner. He stood, hand on the back of the chair, and felt the house settle over the people in it like a hand you'd trust to hold a horse against sudden spook. Barometer low, boards talking, storm coming. The lull had done its work. The world narrowed to white and sound. Wind quit being weather and turned to work, shouldering the roof, chewing the seams, making the windows shiver in their putty. Snow didn't fall so much as a race sideways, knifed strips, then dust, then a blind milk that erased distance and left only touch to tell a person what was true. Boone took that measure in without asking it to be less. He checked the bar with the heel of his hand, listened to the rope hum outside like a sawstring, and let the room learn the new tempo. The stove held a steady talk. The pinewood spoon bridged the pot like a small truss against bitterness. The cottonwood nameboard over the basket caught a lick of fire and gave it back, the names holding their line. He went to a peg beside the door, unhooked a coffee can punched with air holes, and set it on the table. Inside lay a twist of grease-soaked rag and a stub of kindling. Smudge kit, the kind a man builds when he means to make his own news travel. He laid a flint and steel beside it, then turned to Maybeth. She watched his hands the way a rancher watches a gate in high wind. No fear in it, but no lie either. He didn't crowd her with talk. He set a palm knife, small blade, bone scales, oiled, on the quilt within reach, and let his finger rest on it long enough to say what needed saying. Then he lifted the Navajo shawl, warm from the peg, and shook the red into life. Stay with the creek, the water swallows sign. The words were a rope thrown straight, no story tied to them, no persuasion. She took them and nodded once, that small nod a person gives when the choice is already made and the body is catching up. He showed her the guide rope with his hand, door to pine, to a second run he'd strung earlier that hooked the woodpile and then the gap in the brush where a person could slip into the cut and find the creek by sound alone. He set the smudge can into her palm and closed her fingers around the bale, then tapped the flint and steel and the grease rag in turn. Here, here, and here. She lifted the can, felt its light truth, and tucked it into the crook of her arm. They worked together without confessing that it was that. He pulled a long strip of ticking from the shelf, rolled it in his hands to warm it, and handed it over. She slung the smallest across her back strapped with the ticking under the shawl, so weight rode high and close. He took the second child and wrapped her in the saddle blanket like a winter loaf, then set the bundle into Maybeth's arms. The third he swaddled in the coat he'd keep open at the chest to make a pocket of heat, then eased her into the crook of Maybeth's other elbow. 3 heartbeats settled against her ribs like they'd always known where to go. Her bandaged wrists said their piece about hurt and strength and then quieted. She tested her footing, rose to sit, then to stand. The shawl made a red weather of its own around her shoulders. She looked smaller with all that weight and somehow more. Boone crossed to the bone bead string, turned it so it lay easy at the basket's edge, and then lifted it free. He tied the loop to the blanket's corner where the smallest could find it by feel and not lose it to the white. Maybeth bent her head and kissed the beads, not pious, not dramatic. Just the plain human thank you a person gives the one thing that kept a night from coming apart. He opened the door a hand's breadth. The first gust talked hard. He set his shoulders to it and let it blow through the crack, then put the door wider till a person could slip without fighting. The rope between porch and pines made its tin rattle, 2 notes, then fell back to hum. He took the flask Nettie had left, uncorked it, and set it to her lips for the sort of sip that warms more than it burns. She swallowed, winced because split lips do, then nodded once and took Mercy's bundle higher against her chest. Lila went easy into the crook of her other arm, face turned inward where heat holds. Fern fussed once at the change, and then went back to the stubborn work of living. He stepped out first, his body making a wall. He caught the rope with his left hand and placed her right hand into it, like he was putting a rein where it belongs. She found the first loop and hooked her wrist through, tested it, then took a breath she didn't bargain with and stepped into the white. They went to the pines together, boots finding old memory under new snow, the way a horse can feel a packed trail through a drift, by the give of it. The rope thrummed in their hands. The little tin chattered when wind changed quarter, and the loops showed up right where a man had tied them, at the count his legs knew without seeing. At the covert of fir and birch, where the ground falls toward the creek, he stopped, set her in the lee, and pointed with 2 fingers, the sign cowhands use when breath is better saved than spent. Down slope, listen for water, ride the black seam of it where it shows. When she hit the rise on the far side, there'd be a snag and a shelf of rock, Nettie's line of sight from the store window, good lee to light the smudge. One long pull of smoke, one short. There, pattern. After that, keep the creek for a piece, then cut the willow flats to the telegraph road. He drew it in the air. She watched with both eyes and with the set of her mouth. He put the palm knife into her bandaged hand and closed her fingers around it so the handle fit true. She didn't look at the blade. She looked at him. In her eyes there wasn't apology or plea, only the teeth of resolve. He said the line again because some lines have to be said twice to turn from words to tools. Stay with the creek. The water swallows sign. The wind carried it off, and they let it go. She took the rope and stepped. The white caught her, tried to tell her old truths about what she was and wasn't, and she told it back a new one by how she moved. The shoal went crimson in the churn, red fruit in a pine. The babies were quiet, the kind of quiet that means warmth is winning. Boone watched until her shape thinned to movement more than sight, till the tin rattle went to a faint talk and then to memory. He stayed long enough for the rope to stop describing her weight and start describing only wind. Then he turned and set about the business of making lies the storm would swear to. He took a coil of lariat off the peg and walked the yard's far lip to where two birches stood at a slant, like men in a whisper. He hauled the rope taut between them chest high and hitched it solid, then cut off a length and tied a worn coat, one he kept for mending fence in sleet, by the shoulders to the limb of a limber pine. He set a hat on the knot and fastened it with a skiver through the crown. Wind took the limb and made it sway with a human kind of indecision. From a distance, a man would call it somebody he meant to be mad at. He walked backward from there with a fir bough dragging behind him by the rope, a broom sweeping his tracks into the white. He stopped at the corner of the cabin and took the bough into the pocket where the wind eddied, shook it clean, then set it to drag again as he worked a crooked path toward the south trail, just enough to make a story for the three men in a hurry who weren't watching close. He left the smear of a fire off the trail, a cold circle of ash he'd saved from 3 nights ago, sprinkled where snow would make it look like fresh. Lies do better when you feed them a piece of truth. He went to the dun, who stood with his head inside his chest, snow packed in the frog again despite the picking he'd done and the careful ground. Boone lifted each hoof, thumbed the ice out till the clefts were honest, then threw a second saddle blanket over the loins and pulled the first tight. He worked a hand under the wool to be sure heat pooled where it should. The gelding shivered once and then set his feet, the way good horses do when they're thinking for two. He lit a lamp and set it in the window crooked so the light would throw long across the yard and find the swinging coat and hat in terrible weather and make them man-sized. He set another lamp low in the back room and cracked the door so it would talk like someone moving in there. He took the cottonwood board in his palm, felt the weight of it, and pressed it once to set the letters in his hand. Mercy, Lila, Fern, a brace for the part of a man that shakes when he'd rather it didn't. He grabbed the coffee can smudge from the table where a second sat ready. He'd built 2 for a reason, and set it by the back step under the crate. If he had to pull the law twice, he would. He put the flint in his pocket where his fingers could find it without looking. When he came inside, the room had changed the way a room does when someone has left it with a purpose. Not colder, just more honest about how thin the skin is between what a man owns and what he hopes for. He fed the girls what the spoon would hold, 1 pass each, no more and no less, then set the bone beads into the angle of a small palm and watched the fingers close. The Navajo shawl on the peg lifted in the draft and fell. The name board didn't move at all. He stood in the middle of the floor and found his breath. He checked the count, door, bar, rope, lamp, Broom swish, horse smudge, fire, names, milk. He put his hand to the stove and took the heat into his palm like a man tucking a promise into his coat. Wind freshened. The rope sang in a lower key. Somewhere out in the white a branch went off the wrong way and cracked loud enough to make the Dun lift his head and point one ear. Then another sound laid over all of it, the kind that lives in a man's back, before his ears tell him anything. Hooves, not many, not few. 3 from the weight and the lay of the beat, riding a line instead of a search, coming toward the porch, cutting the blizzard like it was their job. Boone moved to the door and opened it to the lamplight. The yard leapt and shrank in the blow. The swinging coat and hat took a breath and nodded like a man he didn't care for. He set his feet in the door and let the light spill around him. Not out of pride, out of mathematics. Men find what they see. He intended them to see him first and last. He felt the names on the board behind him as if they were pressed between his shoulders, steadying his stand. Snow needled his face and then melted where the warmth reached it. The yard shortened. The shapes came on. He set his hands open and dropped his shoulders like a man ready to lift something heavy. The Dun blew once in the lee, and then went quiet. Inside, 3 small breaths kept time. Outside, the storm showed him 3 figures and no mercy at all. He stood in the doorlight and waited. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. They came out of the white on a straight line. 3 shapes pushed hard forward by a wind that wanted them gone and couldn't make it so. The lamp in Boone's window threw a torn sheet of light across the yard. Flakes crossed it fast and slant like sparks blown backward. The coat and hat he'd rigged on the limber pine wagged a slow, foolish nod. The men didn't even look, rode past it with the indifference of trouble that knows its own name. The first rider slid out of the saddle in one practiced drop. He moved like a man who'd paid for his clothes twice. Once at the store, once in the kind of rooms where nobody keeps a ledger. Ezekiel Voss shook his hat once hard to free the brim of ice, then let the wind finish the job. His coat was a town cut trying to pretend it belonged to country. The other 2 sat their horses, scabbards up, reins slack, eyes busy where they shouldn't be. The storm made them ghosts and then men again, in turns. Boone held the doorlight, feet set shoulder-wide on boards that knew him. Heat licked his back from the stove. Cold needled the skin of his face and stopped there. The cottonwood name board on the inside wall lay high and sure. Rawhide thongs double-knotted, letters oiled and dark. Mercy, Lila, Fern. He felt it like a brace right between his shoulders, though it was 5 feet off his back. Voss came to the bottom step and stood there, head tilted in the manner of a buyer looking over a line of stock. He didn't waste voice on preface. He had reasons instead, worn smooth from telling. The debt he'd taken to build more than he could work. The drive he'd lost to weather and miscount and his own certainty. The bank that wanted a better story than next time. The brothers who watched him like tallymen and judged him short. In that litany, the need for a son came up twice, each time with the angle of a man who thinks paper will listen if it's been flattered enough. He made the girls into liabilities, the woman into property, himself into something like law because he'd learned the brand inspector's coffee hour. Boone didn't answer him. He let the wind take the talk and chew on it. He kept his hands loose, his body turned just enough to keep the room at his back and the yard in his eye. He was one man, a lit stove, a door with an oak bar, a hand's breadth from falling into place. That was the whole of it. Voss set his boot on the first tread. The horse on the right shifted and showed white around the eye. The second rider, new hat, bad sense, butt stroked forward off the saddle like he'd lived inside the move for days. The gun stock caught Boone high on the shoulder, where old work keeps its ache and new pain finds purchase. The world tilted, The doorway tilted with it. He went back 3 steps in a stagger that felt like falling through last summer's heat into winter's teeth. He hit the inside wall hard. The name-board took the shock, popped one thong and swung down on the other, like a door within a door. It hung there between him and the room, split along the grain with a sharp, dry sound. The rawhide held. The board canted, a poor man's shield, screening the low light, taking the line where a pistol would look. Boone slid to a knee without meaning to. The kettle jumped on the stove, the pinewood spoon clattered, and found the pot rim again like it had been tied there by luck. He threw his palm up to stop the board from swinging full open and bared his teeth at the jolt that went to bone. Blood came fast from a scrape he hadn't felt starting, ran over the split wood and rimmed the letters. Mercy first, then Lila, then Fern, like thin paint someone mean had no right to. Voss's pistol lifted, the muzzle made a straight black rule through lamp smoke and storm grit. His jaw worked once like a man trying to chew a debt and failing. For a beat, the wind went close and mean around the porch post. All the big talk got small enough to measure with a thumbnail. Boone used the single piece of air he could afford. The words came out flat, ironed with the heat of his back and the cold of the yard, made only to carry across a step. She belongs to herself. Nothing more. Anything extra would have been a kind of begging, and Winter hears that kind worst of all. The pistol cocked with the tidy click of a man who knows machinery better than mercy. The second rider's barrel swung to keep the sight on Boone's head if the first round ran wild. The third man flattened his hand on the butt of a gun he didn't have the schooling to use in weather like this. The horses blew as one, moved their weight to hind, and set to watch a thing animals are better at seeing than people. Boone pressed his bleeding palm harder to the split board and felt the rawhide bite deeper in the wall notch. He set his other hand to the jamb behind him and pushed, so the canted name board kept the doorway narrow as a letter slot. Stove heat licked his neck. Baby breath moved the red fringe of the shawl down by the hearth. 3 small proofs, steady as heartbeat in a chest a man is trying to keep closed. Voss's hat brim took a flurry and shook it off like a dog does pond water. He leveled the iron, settled the front sight across that little notch carved into his own idea of the world, and began to draw the kind of breath a shot rides best. The lantern cut the yard clean. It swung out of timber at the left, oval of yellow moving with purpose, followed by another, lower. The beam put steadier color to the white, and the white, insulted, tried to erase it and failed. Sheriff Kincaid rode in, oilskin dark with rime, 2 deputies flanking. Their horses came up sure-footed out of the creek cut, the black seam of water folding sound under their hooves. The sheriff didn't lift the lantern. He let it hang so the law rode out from his knee instead of his mouth. Behind them, on foot, small but not small, a woman in a red shawl moved at a count not storm-made. May Beth, shawl blown thin at the edges, smudged and blacked along the rim. Hair rhymed white at the ends where cold had tried and failed to take it. She had a look on her like a person who'd set a thing on fire and then carried the smoke long enough to write Nettie's wire into the right ears. Kincaid didn't shout. He didn't have to. The iron under his coat and the men at his hips said the piece that steers men's hands off triggers. His horse shuffled 1 step and took hold of the ground the way a good animal does when talk turns to deed. The deputies laid their rifles where Voss could count the bores and know what figures were about to do to his arithmetic. The pistol in Voss's hand wavered. Not from fear, from math. He'd figured on 3 men in weather. He'd gotten 3 men in weather, and then the part of the county that keeps its word. May Beth came up beside the sheriff and stopped, where the porch light made her face a place the wind couldn't change. Her bandages were dark at the edges where warm had tried to come back faster than skin likes. She didn't look at Boone. She looked at Voss the way a person looks at a snake. They've decided not to fear anymore because what's left to take? She didn't lift her chin. She didn't drop it either. The law's lantern shone on the bone beads tied at the blanket corner, and the beads winked once, as if an old promise had bent its head in recognition. Kincaid spoke 5 words a man couldn't mistake for anything but orders to his own hands. The deputies moved. Leather creaked the way it does when men take aim without noise. Paper, Nettie's wire made official, brand inspector's scrawl bent under it, lines read by a mouth that didn't drink coffee with anyone for free, lived in the sheriff's pocket like a fact that had found its owner. Voss made the smallest move a person can make and have it still be a choice. His finger eased off pressure. The pistol's hammer came down easy under his thumb. The deputies came in like weather arriving, not fast, not slow, just inevitable. Steel touched his wrist and then his other. The first man with him tried a thought about backing water. Kincaid's horse took 1 step sideways. The thought left. Cuffs tick when they finish being a sound and start being a sentence. Boone let breath loose out of him and found out he'd been poor with it again. He took a hand off the jam and then the other off the split board. The rawhide thong held the broken cottonwood where it had fallen, hung now like a shield over the low of the doorway, catching lamplight in its crack. Mercy, Lila, Fern shone through Boone's blood in a way a man can't rightly stand to look at and can't look away from either. He pushed to his feet. The shoulder Voss's hand had paid him with answered in a hot language men and weather share. The room behind him spilled warmth up his spine as if it could lay a palm there and hold him square. Kincaid stepped to the foot of the porch, close enough for his lantern to make Voss's face into something human again. He said the facts without embroidery, which is the only way facts work in places like this. Voss stared at the door past Boone, at the small, steady light inside it, and in that glance the day told on him for all the reasons greed and face and fear had been trying to talk into a better story. The deputies walked him to their horses with the kind of hands that don't ask. The third man looked at Boone once like a person peering into a house he's never been invited to. Curious, mean, lonely. Then the law took him in the same way it had taken his boss. The white closed around them all like water fills a boot. Maybeth stood at the bottom step still. She didn't reach for Boone. He didn't reach for her. Both of them looked in their own ways at the split board and at what it had kept back. Her eyes took the letters in the blood and made a quiet ledger of it 1 column wide. Debit, credit, balance due. Then she let her breath out slow, and it didn't tear on the way. The sheriff touched his brim at Boone without making a compliment of it. The lantern swung once with the movement and threw a bright oval across the door. Boone felt the weak knees of a man who has been holding his own roof up in a gale and suddenly finds out the ridgepole belongs to the house after all. He slumped to the porch post, not collapsed. Just set his back to the wood like a man paying a bill he'd been owing since dawn. The stove inside kept its steady talk. The pinewood spoon rested in its place across the pot, as if it had known better than to fall. The bone beads made 1 small click from the pallet, where a baby moved in sleep. Then the sound was gone. Outside, the white swallowed hoofbeats, and then men. The lanterns dwindled to 2 warm bees in an empty jar, and then to nothing. The yard filled itself with what wind and snow put there when a story ends right at the door, and wrong everywhere else. Boone stayed put till the board stopped telling his bones what had happened. Then he got up, pressed his hand flat to the split cottonwood, and felt it answer back. He set the bar, oak to iron, a small law in a big country, and turned toward the work that comes after surviving, mending, feeding, counting again. Night went on. Inside, fire held and small breaths kept time. Outside, the ridge practiced forgetting. Winter didn't leave. It loosened its grip the way an old hand does on a rope it's held too long. Days went gray to pearl to a thin, decent light. The eaves learned to drip. A strip of moss found the stoop and took the color of wet coin. Wind turned from a blade to a breath you could square your shoulders to. Boone woke to the smell of carbolic and hot water and the sound of a man who had stitched more hide than paper. Doc Eamon Riley sat him on a kitchen chair by the stove, tilted to lamp, and dug a needle through the flesh, high on Boone's shoulder where Voss's man had paid him. "Hold still," the doc said, as if the words could do more than the hand. He ran the thread with the speed of an old habit and the patience of a church ant. Maybeth fed the kettle and kept the cloths warm. She didn't hover. She stood where a person stands when they plan to be there after the pain stops. The pinewood spoon rocked on the rim of a pot, steam laying itself along the grain, 3 small breaths from the pallet, kept to their own count. Doc tied off the last stitch, laid a palm to the bandage like a benediction a man would deny if you named it so, and leaned back to look at his work. "That arm'll split kindlin' yet," he muttered more to the room than to Boone. "Don't make me a liar." Boone said nothing. His mouth pressed flat and the corners made lines that come from years, not days. He breathed the kind of breath a body saves for when hands aren't watching. Doc packed his kit, took a swallow of black coffee like a punishment he believed in, and went out with his collar up. He left no sermon and no bill on the table. A man could settle later, in meat or in fixing the doctor's fence when the thaw took it, or in the way men keep stores even if the ledger never shows the trade. After, the room turned to doing. Not fast, the kind of pace houses find when they admit they might live. Boone opened the hearth wider, pried the old brick lip out, set a new bed of flat stone, built a crossbar of iron he'd saved from a busted stove ring, and braced it with a length of wagon spring. He worked left-handed where he could, and bore the right with the careful pride of a man who means to get back what was borrowed from him. When he laid the last stone, the stove's draw took it, and the fire sat deeper, broader, and less hungry. Maybeth mixed pale green from a can of pigment and a little milk and oil. She set the shutters on trestles in the yard on a day the wind promised not to break her brush. The color wasn't like grass or river. It was closer to the light that sits behind mountains when evening has done most of its work. The paint made the wood look like it might forgive weather. When she lifted each shutter back to its hinges, the cabin took a softer face and didn't pretend it had earned it easy. Work and quiet made their own hours. Boone would sit with the knife and worry a notch into a length of kindling, old habit, nothing meant of it, and Mercy would find his finger with her whole hand and hold on till his wrist learned a new stillness. Lila, curious and grave, would push herself to standing on the folded quilt and touch the carved letters on the split cottonwood board where Boone had set it low until he could fix it proper. She'd trace the crack like a stream on a map and pat the wood when she got to the end. Fern had a way of listening to the chimney. When a gust shouldered the pipe and made a low moan, she'd coo back, small and sure, answering as if the house had learned to sing and needed encouragement to keep to key. Meals were a piece of bread and a spoon, sometimes the last of the lentils Nettie had sent, sometimes a stew thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl and honest enough to fill a person anyway. Boone drank coffee that had worked twice already and didn't complain about it. The Navajo shawl took its place by the door each day to dry, and its red made the room remember warmth even when the stove didn't speak loud. Maybeth kept to practice. She slipped the bone bead string off the basket when night came, and, one by one, tied a circle of it around each small wrist, not tight, not pretty, just present, then eased it back to the loop when sleep went deep and the beads would not wake anyone. She did it like people set lamps in a window for those who might be coming, even if the road has been snowed under for weeks. No words were made of it. Promises don't need grammar. Morning by morning, the moss at the stoop spread and took hold. A pair of magpies cussed at the dun from the fence and then praised themselves for doing so. The guide rope slackened and then took a new tune in the wind. Boone ran his hand down it often without meaning to, as a man touches a good rein when there is no horse attached. He made small repairs where a house shows you what it lacked. He planed a door edge that had swelled with pride in the storm. He set a new peg by the sill so a shawl could hang without taking the draft's insult. He sanded the pinewood spoon till the bowl shone again and rubbed a thumb of oil into it. Like you'd oil a saddle, you mean, to ride into spring. Once, just once, the room caught them all at the same count. Boone laying down kindling with his left, Mercy catching his pointer like it had her name in it, Lila patting the letter L with solemn insistence, Fern throwing a note back to the chimney's throat, the shawl red as coals in a low fire, and the spoon bridging the pot like an old habit that kept being right. Maybeth watched and let a breath go that made a line down her cheek where salt and heat had met. She didn't wipe it. Some lines a person leaves so they can be seen from the inside later. Neighbors came and didn't stay. Nettie May ducked in once, left a small sack of seed potatoes and 2 books, worn silver at the edges, McGuffey with thumbprints and a psalter with the songs the deacon pretended he didn't hum when he fixed collars. She set them by the nickel that still rode under the spoon and left before thanks could make anybody poor. Kincaid sent a deputy with a note that said only, "Taken to county, hearings when the road allows." The law's words are short when they're doing what they're supposed to. Boone took the hours that weren't eaten by feeding and mending, and made a place for the girls to grow into. A lower bunk along the warm wall, framed out of barnboard. A lip so nobody rolled. A quilt top Maybeth found in a trunk, and pieced with new squares cut from shirts that had given up other jobs. He smoothed each board edge till it forgot the saw and learned a hand. He sanded the crack on the name board to a gentler edge so small fingers wouldn't catch sorrow and splinter at the same time. One evening the stove talked a steady hymn, and the room had settled close. Wind worried the stovepipe, but not enough to ask for attention. Boone set a tin cup of milk back from the hot side so it wouldn't turn, tilted his head and listened like a man about to spend a word he can keep. "We ain't rich, just warm." It had no target. It didn't need one. It laid itself on the table and sat there as if it had earned a chair. Maybeth didn't answer. She lifted the pinewood spoon, tapped it gently twice on the rim of the pot, and smiled without turning it into a show. Her wrists had healed enough to grip. The wraps were off. The skin wore new maps. Not pretty, true. March lavished its wet where it wanted and withheld where it pleased. The path to the root cellar turned to honest mud. The ridge showed a hint of brown along the ribs where wind had eaten the last snow, and crows drew lines across the sky like notes a man couldn't read but knew by heart. The dun shook his winter and found the horse he'd been hiding under it. The board over the hearth waited, split, holding by one thong like a poor man's pennant after a war. Boone took a length of rawhide he'd soaked and stretched, and he rebored the hole the break had worried. He worked the lace through and hauled it snug, then set a second and a third where the wood had wanted to lie wrong. He trimmed the tails and rubbed oil into the face, thumbs moving slow over Mercy, Lila, Fern, till the letters woke to the light again. He stood on the chair, shoulder tender but stubborn, and rehung the cottonwood board where it had first belonged, high enough to bless, low enough to be seen. The crack ran true across it like a creek in drought, not hidden, not apologized for. He set his palm to it and felt the wall answer, sound and better, for the story it carried. He stepped down and put the chair back where it lived. The stove drew like a contented animal. 3 small girls slept with their fists the wrong side of open. Maybeth tucked the bone beads back to the basket loop and let her fingers rest there as if the beads were a pulse. Outside, the last of the ice let go from under the eave and fell to earth with a gentle break. The moss at the stoop lifted its small green faces to no one in particular. The house was still poor by most reckonings, and rich by others a ledger can't tally. The board hung scar and all, a mark earned. The day leaned toward evening like a man toward his own door. The next breath belonged to what comes after mending. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Evening came on the slow way, as if the sun meant to shake hands with every ridge before it left. Light ran along the porch rail and set a thin fire in the moss at the stoop. Inside, a pan of cornbread breathed honey into the room. The knife mark in its brown top looked like a trail that had found the right canyon at last. Maybeth turned the loaf out onto a board and laid the pine wood spoon across it, as if to tell the steam not to hurry. She set 2 tin cups by the plate, one for coffee, one for milk, and wiped her palms on a clean towel that had learned red from the Navajo shawl drying on its peg. The shawl gave back a faint warmth to the air, the kind a room keeps when it knows winter by its first name and answers without fear. The cottonwood nameboard hung square over the hearth, scar running true across the letters like a creek that stays honest even when it's low. Mercy, Lila, Fern held the last of the daylight in their cuts. Oil made a soft shine of the edges. On the pallet, the 3 had climbed into evening like it was a thing to be played with. Mercy worked her careful grip into Boone's forefinger when he reached to set a log. Lila stood, wobbled, and patted the L as if checking it hadn't moved. Fern hummed a tune that matched the stove's low talk and didn't ask its permission. Boone stood in the door to the yard with a hand on the jamb, watching the slope turn the color of a good pair's skin. The dun switched his tail and nosed the fence post, then threw his head as if remembering a joke he'd told himself all winter. Far off, a hawk leaned into the ridge wind and held there like a note a fiddle won't let die. He sat on the step and pulled the little plane he kept for stubborn edges from his pocket, took 3 curls off the top rail where a splinter had thought to get uppity, then set the tool down and wiped his palm along the smooth. His face had the kind of lines that don't make a case about being there. When Maybeth came to the door with 2 cups and the spoon set square across the plate, he shifted and made room with his knee, the way a man does when a place has had his shape in it a long while and he means to share. They didn't talk. They ate warm bread with honey like a prayer you can chew, and swallowed coffee that had been asked for once already, and still came when called. Her shoulder eased into his arm in a way that didn't ask if it was allowed. He let his weight go a little toward her, not enough to make her carry any, just enough to say a roof is a thing you hold together without thinking about it. From the far side of the yard came a soft clink, polite as a cough on a church pew. Deacon Jonas Fitch rode up on a claybank mule that looked older than most arguments. He stepped down, lifted his hat without making a ceremony of it, and reached into his saddlebag. Out came a small porch bell, a mule shoe hammered thin, a tongue made from a nail with its head peened to a coin of scrap brass. He hung it under the eave with 2 careful taps from a hammer he'd wrapped in cloth so the sound wouldn't scare the evening. He turned and looked at the door where they sat, met both their eyes with a nod that carried more than one Sabbath of meaning, and swung back up. No sermon, no fee, The mule blew once, and they were gone along the trail. Dust not even bothered to rise. The bell took a first breath of wind and answered it with a small ring, new-made, clean, the sort of sound a place needs to learn its own name by. Maybeth set her hand on Boone's, neither of them looking to see if the other had seen it. Inside, the bone beads, now threaded soft on little cords at 3 wrists, clicked once in sleep and then forgot about it. The Navajo shawl steamed a curl of air that smelled like sun caught in wool. The spoon lay straight as a rule across the plate, a simple piece of wood that had done a winter's work and meant to do another. He turned his head then, slow, face lit by the last of the day. Crow's foot lines made their small map at the corners of his eyes. She met that look and let it rest. Out in the meadow, a strip of grass showed itself the color of olive, and then let dusk take it back. The house sat on its sill, true as a hand laid on a child's back. He spoke at last, one line set down like a brand in wet hide. Plain, durable, meant to be seen from a distance if a rider happened along and needed to know where he was. If this tale keeps your hands warm, tell it by your own fire. The bell agreed. The stove answered in its own language. The 3 names on the wall kept their watch, and the light went down over a yard that didn't owe winter anything extra, over a door that had learned to stay unlocked, over 2 people who had found, without swearing to it, that a promise will sometimes hold even in a country that doesn't have much use for them. The last of the honey shone on the plate like a small map of gold. Boone reached, set the spoon square again though it hadn't moved, and stood. Maybeth picked up the cups. The bell let go one more note just because it could. Inside, the fire laid itself for night, and the house, the poor, rich house, kept its heat the way a good hand keeps a colt, quiet, steady, with both eyes open. Evening settles easy on the crazy mountains. The stove keeps its low talk. The cottonwood nameboard holds fast, and somewhere a small porch bell answers the wind with one true note. If this story set a little warmth in your hands, leave us a line down in the comments. Tell where it found you or what part you want to carry into your own winter. If you'd like more trails like this, slow fire, steady hearts, press a quiet like so we know to keep writing. And if you mean to come back, hang your bell on our porch by subscribing. That way, when the next tale lights up, you'll hear it ring. Ride gentle. Keep your door unlocked to the good that comes.